Well, folks, welcome back to CrossPolitic. I have with me, of course, one of our hosts, Toby Sumter.
All right, here we are.
We're going to do this. And then I also have in our studios Dr. Ben Merkle, president of New St. Andrews College. And then on the phone, I have Charles Sykes. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Merkle and Charlie.
Hey, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
It's a twofer.
Yeah, twofer today. Okay, so we're going to discuss actually your book. So Charles, just give a little background on Charles. You are an author, and you also a radio host yourselves, aren't you?
I am.
I'll expect
that's my day job.
Okay, well, we'll expect a grade on our show after this. So one of the books, your newest book is Fail You. That's basically Fail University, and it's kind of in a lot of ways a condemnation on current higher education promises. And I think when I read through your book, I think the one thing that first I couldn't get away from this, where it seemed like the root of universities they're failing systematically, but it's not a situation where you can just change and adjust the system or change maybe some sort of legislation. It seems like there's like a fundamental problem with universities in the U.S. Is that kind of more what you're trying to get at? Is like there's fundamental issues and not just some sort of structural change that will make things better?
No, I can't imagine what one thing would make a difference. I mean, higher education, first of all, is this massive complex that's really embedded into our economy and our culture. And I think that, one of the things I talk about is why it's been so hard to make colleges more accountable, why efforts at reform have failed in the past. And in part, it's because they have had a monopoly access to something that's been crucial, which is the bachelor's degree. And as long as people thought that the bachelor's degree was essential for being part of the middle class, then they were willing to pay higher and higher tuition. They were willing to put up with a lot of the indifference and the absurdity of higher education, because really it was just something you did. This is what, and I start off with a scene of parents at a graduation ceremony saying to one another, "We did good." Now, did that mean that their children got a good education, a quality education, that they actually saw professors in the classroom or had a curriculum that made any sense? No, it meant that they got that one degree. I think that may be changing now.
Now, you would you connect that bachelor degree problem also to private education?
Well, yes, and I want to make it clear that I'm not painting with a completely broad brush here. Obviously there are still schools that are quite committed to providing a quality education, and I think some of the smaller liberal arts schools or religiously based schools have a very, very clear idea of what their mission is. But I think what's happened is that higher education got away from a focus on the life of the mind. They got away from a focus on students as people, who needed to be educated, and began pursuing their own agenda. And that's why you have this massive explosion of cost, massive explosion in debt, bureaucracies that have grown out of control, Taj Mahal building projects that have really made higher education this out of control behemoth that it is today.
Why have we gotten away from that? I mean, what's the cause, you think, of us forgetting that the education of people is in the life of the mind is central? What's causing that?
Well, and again, this is not true at every single college, but I think it starts at some of the biggest and most prestigious universities, where the focus has not been on undergraduate education for decades. And I ought to just give you a little bit of background here that this is really kind of a follow-up book to a book that I wrote almost 30 years ago called Prof Scam, and that talked about the flight from teaching, the dismantling of the curriculum, where universities decided they were about something else, about the research agenda, or they were about, serving some other master as opposed to what happened in the classroom. And I revisited it and basically found that flight from teaching, that devaluing of the undergraduate education, has actually gotten a lot worse in the last 3 decades. So part of that is the answer to the question, what is a university about? And a lot of those universities, you may list, 10 major missions, and at the bottom of that list is the actual education of the undergraduate student.
Charlie, this is Ben Merkle. I was introduced. I'm the president of New St. Andrews College. We're a small private Christian liberal arts college, and I would just, by way of introduction, say I can't recommend your book highly enough. I just thought it was such a you really put your finger on what's going on in higher ed in so many different points in that book. I've already put this on the reading list for the board of New St. Andrews to read because I just think it's really good. And anybody who's thinking critically about college and what they want to do for college, I think this is a great introduction and an important read. And one of the things, definitely. And one of the things that I thought you noted the irony of how the more we throw free money at schools, the more expensive they get. And I'm wondering if you could flesh that out, and then also maybe say something about this idea of what if all of college was to become free? What's that going to do to the expense of it?
Yeah, this actually goes back to something that former Education Secretary Bill Bennett noted back in the 1980s. He actually wrote a piece called Our Greedy Colleges. And what he documented was that every time the government provided more free money to colleges, colleges used that as a green light to spend the money and to make it more expensive. Every single time we have pumped government tax money into higher education has gotten more and more expensive. So then you ask the question, what happens if we go along with this idea of free tuition? Well, I think there are two problems right now in higher education. One is the cost of higher education, and second is the value of higher education. And value means, what are students learning? Mm-hmm. Are they really being prepared? And I don't mean just being prepared for jobs, but again, what kind of an education are they getting? Free college tuition does not address either one of those problems. It will not make college cheaper. It will make it more expensive based on this experience. And it will basically be a bailout of higher education, which means that those schools that are not providing value in return for tuition will no longer feel the pressure to up their game, to put more professors in the classroom, or to address these concerns. And one of the things that I address very bluntly is that the reality is we have too many young people who feel they need to go to college. This whole notion of college for all sounds good for politicians, but the reality is that not everyone needs to go to college. And as a result of this push to push everybody into a four-year college mold, I think we're setting too many students up to fail. I think there are too many students who spend too much time pursuing degrees that cost too much money, when in fact we don't need to be doing that right now.
Yeah. I think that's dead on, but it's also complete heresy.
Yeah, I'm fully aware of that.
When's the last time you got invited to a university to speak?
Well, it's funny because I tell the story in the book about the number of times that when my first book on higher education came out, I spent a lot of time on college campuses, and obviously some of them were very hostile. But I also had some interesting experiences. I went to one big university here in my home state of Wisconsin, where I was talking about this flight from undergraduate teaching, how students would be lured to big universities by the prestigious faculty and all these famous professors, and then when they got there, they found out that they were blurs in the parking lot, and instead, a lot of the teaching had been turned over to graduate students. And by the way, this is something that I think smaller liberal arts schools really ought to market, is that you actually get professors in the classroom as opposed to, for example, teaching assistants that may not speak understandable English.
Right.
But I remember one of the first times I talked about that, I had a professor at the University of Wisconsin stand up and say, Mr. Sykes, that's just simply not true. We don't do that here. We do not have graduate students who don't speak English in the classes. And I was a little bit taken aback because, of course, they did. And so rather than, engage in a, he said, back and forth, yes, no, yeah. I asked the audience, the students, and there were about 300 or 400 of them. I said, how many of you here in this room have had classes with teaching assistants who do not speak understandable English? and about 3/4 of the hands went up.
Wow.
and it was one of those. The guy was just going to stand there and just flat out deny that it took place.
Wow.
But the other thing that I got a lot of on campuses when I spoke to professors and talked about why they didn't teach more was complaints about K-12 education. How many students are showing up for showing up for college, and they're not prepared to do college work at all. They've just been set up. They've been admitted. They've been given diplomas, but they just cannot do college level work, and this is a huge problem in American higher education.
Mm-hmm.
With all the data you got at in your book, and I mean it's heavy data. Why are colleges seemingly kind of rejecting this narrative when you can, there's a lot of facts behind the bankruptcy of universities?
Well, I mean, they reject it is because this is their culture. They want to preserve the status quo. They're going where the money is, and the money for them is once they get the tuition money, those warm bodies in the classroom. They want to pursue other contracts, other priorities, research, and obviously they don't want to acknowledge that they, in fact, have been providing less value for more cost. I mean, all institutions resist criticism. I mean, that's the status quo is the status quo for a reason. Most institutions have to adapt or they die. In the case of higher education, however, because they are tenured in, they have been remarkably resistant to change. Yeah. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, in part that's because parents in society been willing to write out the check, almost with no questions asked. But again, I think with this higher education bubble and the $1.5 trillion in student debt, that may be changing.
Seems like one of the bottom line things here is that you've got, education has become a business, and when education becomes a business, then the bottom line financially is the bottom line. Whereas if education is a mission, then people are willing to sacrifice a great deal financially to carry out a mission.
Well, that's exactly right, and certainly what I would encourage parents to do is look. Obviously we have, all of us who are parents want the best for our children. We want to get them the best education possible, and we're prepared to write out some pretty big checks. But I guess what I would say to people is, look, if you want your sons or daughters to get a good quality education, be smart consumers. Look for those colleges and universities that are actually focused on teaching. Don't simply assume because the tuition bill is high that you're going to get a better education. I understand how powerful, always pursuing the most prestigious degree might be, but ask yourself, what is the value added? And there ought to be more value assigned to schools that actually treat undergraduates seriously, as a whole person, and are committed to educating that young person. And I think that if we think of this as a marketplace, though, a marketplace of competing schools, there are outstanding choices, but there are also some truly horrible choices.
What a crazy idea that real value is actually more valuable.
Exactly. Well,
it's like gravity. You tried it?
Yeah. Well, that's why I think we have a bubble, though. It's not just that the cost of higher education has exploded, so much faster than the rate of inflation, and the debt has exploded. It's at the same time the value that people are getting for that has been declining, and this is what makes for bubbles. It kind of reminds me of the housing bubble. Yeah, people just okay, so I'm going to spend $50,000 a year on tuition, but it's worth it because it will lead to these middle class jobs. Well, what happens when those middle class jobs aren't there? What happens when people start asking tough questions about, well, what exactly did we get for that $50,000 a year? And I think that's beginning now.
Do you see what appears to be some upcoming upheavals in accreditation? Do you see that as something that's likely to help pop this bubble or mask it?
Yes. Accreditation is a huge issue because this is part of this gatekeeper. This is part of This is part of the way in which higher education protects itself and perpetuates itself. So I would certainly encourage alternative forms of accreditation to be able to say, look, we can't have a one size fits all for all of these schools. We can't continue to reward what the what the higher education complex values as opposed to what I think parents and students ought to value. So yeah, that's going to be a key component.
It seems like, bottom of a lot of this, I mean, it's hard to miss the fact that simultaneously, while all this is happening, there's this massive erosion of commitment to just the idea of truth.
Oh.
Right? I mean, so just the idea that there's actually truth and that there's, objective reality to study and to know. I mean,
and at some point your feelings just don't count.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like Gabe said, gravity, have you tried it? I mean, like there's this reality out there. And so that that's how you measure real value. So when we're talking about real value, we're talking about students that go in with knowing less, coming out knowing more, and that you can actually measure that, and it's real and it's true and objective. And while we, it doesn't seem like a surprise at all then that we devalue truth, and then we're surprised that truth isn't the way we measure value.
It's interesting you bring that up because I just gave an interview a little while ago on a completely different subject, actually, about how we have really become a post-truth society.
Yeah.
That our politics are post-truth. And that we have a tendency to blame, the media, which I'm willing to do, and the political class and politicians for this. But the reality is that we, as a culture, have devalued the concept of truth. We've devalued the creating critical thinking so that people can actually engage in linear thought and ask whether this is true or not.
Yeah.
Alan Bloom wrote this book about the closing of the American mind back in the 1980s.
Yep.
And the lack of ability of a generation to basically make distinctions between truth and falsity, between right and wrong, to engage in sequential logical reasoning, and to make moral choices. There's a consequence to society for having an educational system that does not value those things and does not present those things.
You've been complimentary to the liberal arts colleges up to this point, but I think on that subject, the liberal arts colleges are probably the most to blame for that slide.
That's interesting.
And basically meaning that truth is absent, or the desire for truth in liberal arts.
Because they're the ones driving the sort of the postmodern, post-truth ideology.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So
no, it's funny because that's not funny. That was not the word. It's not funny at all.
But we'll laugh.
The first time I began writing about postmodernism was back in the 1980s, when it was very much an academic phenomenon. And to look back on it now and to realize how that kind of thinking has now seeped into the general culture, how it has become popularized, and how it really drives and affects much of the political debate that we have right now. It's kind of alarming. Yeah. But again, it goes back to something that we all know and need to be reminded of, is that ideas matter. Ideas have consequences, and sometimes the consequences are pretty dramatic.
Right, but if language really is just coercive and violent, and it doesn't actually correspond to reality and so on, then everything is just manipulation, and so you're just trying to get what you can get, and then you go back to college. Bachelor's degrees are basically a union card.
Yep. Yes, exactly. So you get the union card, and what that card actually represents becomes less significant.
Right.
Because what is an educated man? What is the knowledge that they're supposed to have? Well, higher education discourages asking questions. I mean, the higher education complex, discourages that, because they want you to focus in on that union card or the prestige of their degree.
You noted a quote from William Bennett where you said that in your book, this quote, he said that higher education is underaccountable and underproductive. I'm just wondering if we were to rectify that, what does it look like to get higher education accountable? To whom should it be accountable? who's failing to give it the grade it needs to receive right now?
Well, yeah, and that's probably a long answer for that. But I mean, obviously, it should be accountable. First of all, to society and to the students as well. I do think that in terms of accountability, there ought to be this question, basic questions like, okay, what is the value added? What has someone learned in the 2, 3, 4, 5 years that you spend in higher education? Does every single degree have to be a 4-year degree? Can we now begin talking about possible alternatives? Can we look at different ways of teaching and presenting and evaluating knowledge? All of those things I think are out there. But right now, you go to any major university in America and ask basically, okay, so what does, a 4-year degree, what has someone learned? Can you tell us, can you quantify it in any given way, in any way? The answer is no. They can't do it because they don't want to do it. There's no measurement whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And if you are charging the kind of money that people are paying right now, there's got to be some sort of accountability.
So I have worked in corporate life for the last 10 years, 11 years, and the common understanding is you get what you measure. And so you get what you measure, and it's kind of like you get what you incentivize. Well, you also get what you measure. I feel like part of my work had been in education, and they're always talking about, oh, well, we just need to change this, or we just need to tweak this policy. Okay, the incentives are slightly off, or this continuing education fund needs to be reworked to incentivize this better, whatever. And they're always talking about the surface issues of how to make education better and work smoothly and get the right outcomes that they desire. It seems like they're just going around and around in circles. Let me get to my question here. We're a Christian podcast, and I feel like nothing is being discussed at the root of the matter. The root problems aren't being discussed. I believe that all truth begins with Jesus. We don't have math. We don't have you don't get 1 + 1 = 2 without there being a logical God driving that system, right? You can't even make that up out of thin air. And so, I mean, like, Harvard, a lot of these colleges that were foundational to America's educational system were founded on that truth. We're founded on Jesus Christ being the basis of all truth. And so the farther we get away from that, now you see in our education system, we got emotional angst everywhere. That's not anchored to any sort of truth. And no university, I can't tell you how many education professors, presidents that I've worked with in the last 10 years who either would not answer the question, what is truth, which should be a basic question that every college president should be able to answer, right? Just what is truth? Your job is to defend that. You're the president, answer it. Or would just say, that's a good question and kind of leave it there. I know that's kind of not really a question, but a lot of thoughts there.
These are the kinds of questions that I think parents and students need to ask. I think they need to ask questions like this. If I come to your institution, what will I learn? Do you take concepts like truth seriously or not? I think that a lot of parents would be really shocked by the intellectual atmosphere of what actually goes on in the classroom. And this does, as we mentioned, apply to small liberal arts schools as well. So again, ask those kinds of questions. And I think, if for no other reason, that it'd be entertaining to watch the college presidents squirm.
Yeah.
So we got a couple minutes left. Let's maybe give Charlie one more question. Do you guys want to?
Yeah. I'm curious, towards the end of your book, you started pointing towards this idea that, is it the MOOC?
Yes.
Yeah, MOOCs.
The MOOCs, as this sort of disruptive new thing. And it seemed like, and I think you acknowledged this to a certain degree, but it seemed like, is not the MOOC just another version of the same problem we're having of a very distant education, where I can understand how a MOOC would be disruptive to a dysfunctional university the way that you've described it, but a functioning school that was really delivering what it promised, isn't the MOOC actually a distant second or third to the quality that you would get in a real classroom?
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Now, the MOOCs are these, it's a terrible acronym, massive open online classes.
Yeah.
What it would do, though, would be for a smaller school, a way of kind of weaponizing their curriculum, where I would envision that you find the best and the brightest teachers from all over the country, and you'd be able to add them to your basically store of weaponry, so that students would be able, and again, you can pick and choose which ones you want to offer, and which ones would share your value. But for example, if you wanted to have a course by somebody like Robert George from Princeton, or somebody else who might be teaching at the University of Washington, these really high level courses can be a supplement rather than a replacement. Mm-hmm. But my main point is that they provide a form of technological alternative to the status quo. Every other industry, every other institution has been changed and transformed by these new technologies. Why not higher education?
I really like that weaponizing curriculum line. I think we should popularize that. We're going to weaponize our curriculum. That's great.
That was actually a bit of a microaggression.
Back to the question that Ben was asking a minute ago about accountability. I think it seems like what the force of all this is that, the government, like it does with many other things in the market, kills accountability. If you have free money flowing into the market, you don't have to. There's the market forces that are meant to make you compete. They dissipate
or minimize.
Yeah. So is the way forward to real accountability for schools getting government out of it?
Yes, to the extent that you possibly can, and that's why I'm concerned about these government bailouts that some of the politicians are talking about. That in fact it would eliminate that pressure to be more accountable. And going back to this question of accountability, unfortunately, a lot of schools do think that they are accountable not to the students, but to government, and government bureaucracy is becoming increasingly heavy-handed on these schools, pushing their agenda, using laws that were never intended for the purpose they are, to push their agenda. But a lot of what's going on with the microaggressions and the safe spaces and some of the handling of sexual assault is being very much driven out of Washington by the federal government. And you do have a lot of the policies of schools that are being pushed by this political agenda and this political narrative.
Yeah.
That's very good. Well, folks, you can pick up Charlie's book, Fail You, that's Fail You, University, The False Promise of Higher Education. You also, like you mentioned, a book you wrote, kind of a prequel to this, was Prof Scam. Mm-hmm. You wrote back in the 80s. Yep.
Yeah.
And,
we'll link both these books on the CrossPolitic website, so our listeners can go check those out on Amazon and order them up, share them. Give them to their friends for Christmas.
Send them to your senators and legislators.
That's right. Thanks so much for your time, Charlie. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Charlie.
Well, my pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much.